Action. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Robert Swartwood here. Tonight, I am joined by an author who was a paramedic in Toronto and a tactical medic with the Ontario Prov. How you say it again, Steve?
Ontario
Provincial
Provincial Police.
Provincial Police,
Provincial
where
Police.
he was a specialist in SWAT, CBRNE, HUSAR, HUSAR, and public order. He's also a recipient of the Governor General of Canada EMS Exemplary Service Medal and Bar in recognition of his distinguished service. He is the author of Perfect Shot and Out of the Cold, which just recently came out. That's right, it's your favorite writer and mine, Steve Urszenyi. Steve, how the heck are you?
I'm good. I'm good, Robert. How are you?
I feel tongue-tied. So let's see here. Yeah. So thank you so much for agreeing to hang out. I saw you back at BoucherCon. It feels like a long time ago, but it only was a couple months ago.
Yeah.
Did you have fun at BoucherCon?
Yeah, BoucherCon was good. It was fun, big complex, lots of fun.
Very, very big
Yeah.
complex. Very
Mhm.
big complex. So we're obviously here. We want to talk about the new book. Before we get to the new book and the book that came out last year, because you so far now this is, I guess, what they call your sophomore effort in terms of your writing. I always ask. So, Perfect Shot was your first novel. Had really great blurbs on there. Mark Greaney, Jack Carr, to name a few. Was nominated for the Thriller Award. I think there was some other. Was there a Canadian award that was nominated for?
Yeah, there were three awards in total. So yeah, ITW Best First Novel, Prime Writers of Canada Best First Novel, and the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize. So three nominations.
Wow, it's amazing. Okay, so that was your first novel, and so I always ask, was that your first published novel, or was that your first novel?
First published novel. I had written one previous to that in the series that we went out with at the worst possible timing, right as the pandemic was shutting New York down. So the first novel in the Alexander Martel series may or may not ever see the light of day, but yeah, that went out early 2020. But I was already writing the second book when the pandemic hit, and that became Perfect Shot, and that was the one that was picked up first.
So this is fascinating. So the first book that you shopped around essentially was the same character, so it was the same series. It wasn't like you then, pivoted to a different standalone or a different series character. So is that something that, and we can maybe get into this later, but like,
Hmm.
is this something that then, like a future book would like revisit and maybe not necessarily the whole book or like at least like certain aspects of what happened in that first book?
I'm always hoping that we will get a chance to publish that. I mean, if someone offers to publish it, I'll have to edit it extensively. But yeah, I like the story in that book. It's still Alex Martel. I mean, there's a lot of the same characters. So Caleb isn't in it. If anybody's read Perfect Shot or Out in the Cold, Caleb Copeland isn't in it. But it's more of her Interpol family. So it's Jonathan Burgess, it's Celeste Clicquot, the Secretary General of Interpol, it's your boss, Chief Martin Broussard. So those characters are in the first book, and it takes place. It's still hopping all over Europe. Um, it's kind of a sniper on sniper mystery thriller where she's chasing down someone who's been taking out bad guys from very long range with a sniper rifle and trying to figure out who's doing it and why they're doing it and what's the personal connection to her. As it turns out, there is one. So it's a great story. I'd love to see it see the light of day at some point, but who knows? It'll be up to a publisher.
So is this it would like say a couple books down the line, this would be one of those it essentially would be like a prequel, kind of like the occasional Reacher books that are, take place back when he was in the military, stuff like that. Like this would be in the timeline, would be going back in time.
If you did it according to that timeline, and it would be, yeah, it would have to be kind of a prequel. But if I gave it some thought and sat it down with it for a few months, I might be able to fit it into a future timeline. Some of the things would have to change, obviously, but the the spine of the story is there,
Yeah.
and sort of the big set pieces, if you want to call them that. Um, the set pieces of the story there, the action sequences are there. So could it be massaged into a future story or fit into the series as book 4, 5, or 6? Probably. We'll see. Bob Dugoni, I was talking to Robert Dugoni, another, you probably know Bob and his great series, multiple series that he's got going. Um, and Bob actually read that book and gave me a blurb and was full of praise for it. Was called By a Long Shot. So he was full of praise for By a Long Shot. And when it actually went out, got turned down by two editors as the pandemic was hitting, and Bob just said to me, Steve, I've had books sitting in my drawer for years, but I don't have any books sitting in my drawer anymore. Meaning basically that as his popularity as a writer grew, so too grew the hunger from publishers to publish his stuff and to see more from him. So whatever he might have had in the drawer, he took out, dusted off, cleaned up, and put out there. So it's a possibility that readers will see that in the future in some form or another.
And again, what was that one called?
That's called By a Long Shot.
By a long shot. And then so the first novel that was published was called Perfect Shot. Was that was that the novel you guys had shopped it around at, or was it a different title that then the publisher, changed it sometimes before they publish, they'll like
It,
change the
it
title.
was actually pretty lucky in a way. So when I wrote Perfect Shot, it had the working title Render Safe, which is a term from the explosive ordnance disposal world, the bomb detection, bomb disposal world. As well as you render a weapon safe. But render safe really has it really comes from the bomb disposal world. You render a device safe, right? And there's literature on that and manuals on that and everything else. So it was called Render Safe. And we were quite far ahead into the editing process when the publisher approached me and asked if we could change a title. And they wanted to change a title to Perfect Shot. Um, and I agreed with it because I think Perfect Shot is a better title for the first book in a series. Render Safe, they felt might have been too technical a term, whereas Perfect Shot had multiple meanings, referred more to the character of Alex, not just the one shot deal. So yeah, I was on board with it. So it was just kind of fluky that they used shot in the title as I had used shot in the first title out or By a Long Shot. So
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go back to that first book that you had written and shopped around, the first Alex novel. Now, that was the first novel you had written. Was there anything you had written previous? Any other, anything creative, short stories, poems,
oh yeah,
anything before that?
I dabbled. I mean, since I was a kid, I've dabbled in writing. When I was 9 or 10, I actually started a novel as a 9 or 10 year old. I even mocked, and it was like, 10 really bad handwritten pages in a school notebook. And then I affixed some kind of a cover to wallpaper cover, and I drew a picture on it. So there was cover art. There was a title, which was Ocean Trek. I even put the name of the publisher, an imaginary publisher, on the cover. So I mocked up a whole thing around it. So I've been imagining myself as a writer since I was very young. And then there were all through my life, I was writing poetry, short stories, stories of different kinds and sizes. I did some professional writing. I was a columnist for 3 years in a national paramedic magazine. That actually rekindled my love of writing and helped me perfect or not perfect, but work the craft and get better at the craft to give me the confidence to start writing seriously again. And then, my path took another turn when I was invited to speak to a group of screenwriters, in a writer's room for a TV show that was on at the time. And it was a show about a tactical police unit. The show was called Flashpoint. And
Yeah.
I was a police tactical medic at the time. The show didn't have a medic on the team. So I wanted to talk to the showrunners and the creators of the show about what exactly is it that a tactical medic does in the real world. So we spent a couple of hours shooting the breeze about writing and the show and what a tactical medic does. They decided for creative purposes not to put a medic on the show as part of the team. They introduced a medic later, a recurring cast member later in the show, but they felt having a medic on their team would decrease some of the tension in the show. If an officer got injured and there was a medic right there,
Yeah.
where's the where's the drama really? So they made a good creative decision, but at the same time, when I was talking to them about writing and told them that I had stopped writing because I basically hit a wall and I couldn't find good advice, and because I'm not an outliner, people were saying in books were saying, you're not writing if you're not outlining. And the showrunners basically said, well, Steve, if you want to write, just write. So it was that moment that I actually thought, well, that's a good idea. Why don't I try that? So I actually began writing screenplays at that time. And I taught myself how to write screenplays. That led to the story that became the first Alex Martel story because it started as a screenplay that I then got 30 pages into and thought I'd really prefer to write this as a novel. So I switched it around into a novel long form, and that was the very first Alex Martel story. That's how it all started. So kind of a long, awkward way of getting there, but that is in the end how I got there.
So Flashpoint, I remember looking that up recently. There's an actor. I was watching something and I remember looking on like IMDb and seeing that he was in like who starred in that? Who was the main actor?
Well, there's Enrico Colantoni, there's Hugh Dillon. So
Hugh
Hugh Dillon,
Dillon.
you'll
That's
know
who it
him
was.
from
That's right. Yeah, watching all the
Mayor
stuff
of
he's doing now with
Kingstown
Tyler
and
Sheraton, the mayor of
yeah,
Easton, and saying that's right, Flashpoint. Is that a good show?
Flashpoint or
Yeah, no,
oh
Flashpoint.
yeah, it was a great show. I loved it.
Yeah, all
It
right, I
was
have to
really
check it
good.
out because I remember being like, "Oh, this looks interesting." So, okay,
Yeah,
cool. Yeah, there's just so much TV. So,
yeah.
so okay. So going back though, when you said you were a kid, you were right. So, I mean, what were you reading at that point? Because not, I mean, obviously, I talked to a lot of writers, and a lot of writers obviously wanted to be writers when they were young. Some come to it much later in life, but but I mean, most people, when they're kids or not, they're playing video games, they're not writing stuff. So what were you like, what were you reading or what were you doing that really kind of gave you that inspiration or that feeling that you wanted to write?
Well, I'm lucky, I guess, that I my childhood predated video games. Pong came on, into the world when I was maybe early teens or something. So that's how old I am. But um, my earliest reading forays were science fiction. So it was Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, 2001: A Space Odyssey, um, I, Robot, things like that. And then I got into the Frank Herbert Dune series and read the first three in the Dune trilogy. Well, read the trilogy before it became however many books, eventually got written in that series. So I was a big sci-fi fan up until the mid 80s, late 80s, when suddenly I discovered Tom Clancy and The Hunt for Red October. And those books, Tom Clancy's books blew my mind as far as what a thriller could be and what a thriller was. Because I'd really, sci-fi is not a thriller. It's a different kind of thrill, maybe, but it's not structured the way a thriller is. So Tom Clancy's writing really blew my mind with the technical side, but also the globe-trotting side, the world traveling side, the clandestine CIA side, all those things. And then next thing I know, I'm reading Robert Ludlum and the Jason Bourne series. And I just fell in love with the genre of thrillers, mostly from those two guys. And that got me thinking about writing more again. But those were my earliest influences. Then I fell into Nelson DeMille, who's not thriller per se, but much more, I guess, towards the mystery side, the detective fiction. I love Nelson DeMille's John Corey character because he's this burned out, you know, former cop or NYPD detective turned Joint Task Force guy, and told in the first person for anybody who's read the series. So that's a series I loved. Those were my earliest influences who helped me really shape the kind of writing and the voice I was going to have when I finally started to write on my own.
And so you said that you had written then like 30 pages of a screenplay and then realized that a novel would be better. And you had mentioned before about outlining. So are you at a so when you're approaching the book, are you doing an outline or are you just kind of sitting down with the character and kind of an idea of what the story's going to be and just go from there?
Yeah, so my earliest forays so I'm a pantser. Pure and simply, I'm a pantser. Now, as I go further into my series, I've had to evolve that a little bit because not because I really need to know where I'm going, but because my publisher wants to know where I'm going. So I'm writing a third in the series. And before I signed that contract, the publisher wanted to know what my ideas for the next few Alex Martel books might be. So for them, I put together a 3 or 4 paragraph synopsis of what I thought the stories would be. And pretty much adhering to that synopsis for the third one I'm writing now. But in the beginning, and generally the way I write is I just sit down to the computer, not really knowing what I'm doing that day or what I'm doing at all. I mean, Perfect Shot started with me just picturing Alex. For anybody who's read the book, it starts off with Alex dressed in a ghillie suit, a sniper suit, lying on a forest floor. The rain, it's been raining around her, water's dripping down onto the moss and the rocks around her. She's holding a sniper rifle, looking through the scope. And that was it. The beginning of the book was only, that's what I saw. So the rest of the book took off from there in terms of, when I sat down to write that scene, it was okay, well, what does she see? What is she doing there? And where does the story go? And from day to day, I had no idea. And probably it wasn't until I was about halfway through that I had a well-formed idea now of where the story was going. And then it's a question of kind of going back and backfilling some material that I needed, to sort of build that story up to where I thought it would go. Yeah, so my process really starts with picturing a scenario and a character versus having a story or premise. Some people start with a what if premise. I see that a lot in writing lessons, right? It's about, start with your what if premise. What if ducks could shoot rifles, whatever. So then you build a story around the premise that you've already formulated, whereas I don't do that at all. I picture a character in a moment and then I go from there. What is that person doing in that moment? So yeah, it's a totally different writing process, but works for me so far.
And so when you started, like you said, like all the books that you've written have all featured Alex. So it's not like you've written other major characters or standalones. So from the jump, was the plan always that this was going to be a series? Whereas opposed to sometimes books that become series, they start out as standalones, and then, I think it was like Michael Connolly's the Harry Bosch series. Like initially, he just wrote the first
Yeah.
book as a standalone, and then the publisher's like, "Oh, you should keep telling this, you should come back
Yeah.
to this character." So, but for you, based on what I can tell, is you kind of had an idea that this was going to be a series character from the very beginning.
Well, actually, no. So again, going back to that first one, the unpublished one, um, it was a writing exercise. I was writing a story, didn't know where it was going. I had no aspirations of publishing at the time, no aspirations of doing anything but writing a story. And then as I got towards the midpoint of the story, which was 3.5 years of writing, because I was working full time, I was a paramedic, I was doing other things. I'd come home and I wasn't disciplined about sitting down to write every night. So that's why it took me 3.5 years to write the first half. So I was plainly dabbling in storytelling. But as I got further into the story, there was a kind of an aha moment where I thought, this is pretty good. And I decided I wanted to finish that story. Not to belabor the point, but Thriller Fest became my goal that helped me finish a story because, it was in November that I made the decision to finish it. And I set my sights on Thriller Fest and in particular Pitch Fest, which of course, as you know, but maybe some of the audience members don't know, Pitch Fest is a part of the conference where aspiring authors who are unagented, who don't have an agent, sit down and it's a speed dating session with agents. And I committed to, and you have to go with a finished manuscript. You can't go with an idea. You've got to go with a complete manuscript. So if an agent says, "Hey, I'm interested," you literally hand it over or email it the next day or that night or whatever. So my commitment to myself 6 months ahead of Thriller Fest was that I was going to go down with a finished manuscript. And that gave me the drive to complete my first manuscript. So I was still working from the premise that it was probably going to be, I wasn't thinking even in terms of terminology, standalone series, whatever. It was just, I just wanted to finish the manuscript. And then as I finished it, some point along the way, I thought, this is, it's a good story, but it might make a good series. So by the time I finished by a long shot, I was starting to think about a series. But even then, as you know, we're putting the cart before the horse because you really need to have an agent, and then you have to have a publisher, and the publisher has to express interest, and a lot of times they'll dictate whether it's going to be a standalone or whether they see a series in it or not. So it's all a process, and it's a process, as a writer who's an aspiring published author, most of us don't know anything about that side of things. So it was a story I just wanted to tell and get finished. And the way it was going, I was really enjoying doing the storytelling. So yeah, and then it became the series ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah, I was having conversations with people about Thriller Fest because Thriller Fest is honestly it's much more writer centric in terms
Yeah.
of as opposed to like BoucherCon or other places that focus more, that's more for the readers. That oftentimes I feel like oftentimes writers who want to be professional writers are never really prepared properly on the business, on what to expect, once they actually sell a book. When it comes down to like to taxes, like how much money goes to an agent, how much money you have to set aside, or you have to eventually pay for taxes in your country, and
Yeah.
and like expenses and it's like stuff to be aware of that normal people never really think about. And then the same thing too, even just, publicity, because most times, you are your own PR person. I mean, even the big name authors, a lot of them still, are like they are the ones who are in charge of their own PR. Like I remember hearing, I mean, this was a long, long time ago, but like really famous romance authors, they would set aside a good chunk of their advance for when the book comes
Yeah.
out to use that money to help, promote their books or whatever else. So it's something that just, a lot of writers just think like, oh, I'm gonna sell a book and then that's it. I don't have to, this idea. I always hear people being like, oh, I have to get a publisher because all I want to do is just write. I don't want to have to promote anything. And it's like,
Right.
what are
Yeah.
you talking about? Like what?
No, and that was, the eye-opening thing about Thriller Fest was, and first of all, um, I highly encourage anybody who's not a published writer yet, who aspires to be a published writer, find a conference, whether it's Thriller Fest or one of the other ones that are more or less, as you mentioned, writer specific or focused. Find a conference and go because it does two things to you. One, it will help you with your craft. I mean, you attend the sessions, the seminars, whatever, you're going to get better as a writer. You're going to absorb information by osmosis, hearing the great writers speak, the A-list writers speak, and the B-list writers speak, whatever. You're going to absorb information and learn about the craft because there's more to the craft of writing than simply, punching keys on a typewriter or, using a pen on a pad, a legal pad. The other side of it that you'll learn is the business side and the networking side, through the networking, really. The networking to me is almost the main benefit I derived from Thriller Fest. And networking, not in the sense, in the business world where you shake hands and you meet somebody and maybe you can sell them a pumpkin later because you're making pumpkins this year, but networking in the way that you really meet the people who share the same passion and suffering that you do, trying to get a story out. And for me, that side of the networking, I met people, and one example is Simon Gervais, a great friend of mine now. Simon was one of the first people I met and first friends I made at Thriller Fest. It's kind of like summer camp for writers. Oh, there's my new buddy Simon Gervais. And Simon kept me grounded through the process of looking for an agent, all the rejections, the desire I had to maybe self-publish, which is fine if that's what you want to do. Lots of people self-publish, and it's a viable route. But it wasn't the route I wanted at the time. I wanted to be traditionally published. And Simon just kept saying, focus on that. There's a way to get there. You'll get there. It's being persistent, honing your craft, getting an agent, all those things. So the networking side of Thriller Fest is such, and again, other conferences is such an important part. Meeting people who share your interests, meeting people who can share their stories, because you realize you're not the only one who suffers the same way. Maybe, whatever it is. Maybe you didn't know people actually don't have to plot. Maybe you thought that everybody had to plot or outline, and you've been struggling as a pantser to get your story out. But now you figure out there's other people like you who do the same thing. So it's an interesting, I think conferences are interesting in that they'll teach you the business side, but they'll also, show you your tribe, introduce you to your tribe, the people who are like you all over North America and the world. So I'm a big fan of the conferences.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say, especially Thriller Fest, it's a very supportive convention, conference. Writers are there because obviously they love writing, they love publishing, but they also love supporting, each other. You're not gonna often find writers who don't want to talk or don't want to, give you the time of day. Occasionally you might find a few, but for
Yeah.
the most part, they're very, they're definitely very supportive. And we'll just talk about just the business and kind of give you the lowdown.
Well, and
All right, well,
you
yeah,
mentioned earlier about the blurbs I have. So the Mark Rainey, Jack Carr, Robert Degoni, tons of great writers, Simon Gervais, have given me blurbs, and it, I think it's largely because I've met them in person at conferences. It'd be hard to cold call or cold email some of these big writers and ask for a blurb when they've never met you, don't really know you from Adam, maybe have seen your Instagram feed or your, Twitter feed or whatever it's called. Um, so that networking becomes really critical to helping you build. Again, it's a business side of things, but blurbs, which is you've got to have blurbs. You've got to be able to find blurbs. Your publisher won't find the blurbs for you necessarily. They might dig up a couple, but it really comes down to the author to find those blurbs or those quotes from other writers. And again, that's the conferences. And you have an ITW award behind you that you've won. It's a, Thriller Fest and the ITW, it's a legitimate organization for writers, and it's renowned for producing good writers and supporting good writers and helping to foster their careers. So yeah,
yeah.
it's probably a lot.
Well,
That's
I mean,
probably a
I feel like this whole thing has become a ad for the ITW. But I will say the one good thing about them, and the only reason I'm a member of them is, and this is very, very rare for writers' organizations. If you are a quote unquote professionally published author, you don't have to pay dues, which is just it's one of those things that does not usually happen. A lot of these writers organizations live and breathe on dues. They basically just they just want members to help pay for things. Whereas the ITW, they figure out other ways to really kind of make things because it's not for them. I mean, it's not about the dues. It's not about like making money that way. It's about again supporting just the community in general and everything else. So
yeah.
yeah, no, it's definitely a great organization. But all right, enough of that because they're not sponsoring this video.
They're
Let's
not.
go on to okay, so Perfect Shot. So when you sold Perfect Shot, was that just a one book deal or is that a two book deal?
That was a two-book deal.
And at that point, was it the idea the publisher's like, okay, there's going to be a second book?
Yeah, totally.
And then, so at that point, did you know kind of what, like, well, let's go back to even with Perfect Shot. So you said you started out with that image of her in the ghillie suit in the rain. But then once you started writing, I mean, at what point did you really, did the story really start to crystallize and you kind of knew, okay, this is, these are who the villains are going to be. This is where I'm headed. I mean, or I don't know, like sometimes, I mean, have you ever gotten to a place where you were writing like 5, 10 chapters and realized, oh shit, I'm heading in a wrong direction. I got to scrap this. I got
Yes.
to start over.
Yes, my out in the cold. And the reason I hit that wall and out in the cold, believe it or not, is because I started to outline. So I had outlined to a certain extent out in the cold. So in writing the outline and then following the outline, I got to a point where the story made no sense to me anymore. And I scrapped the first 80 to 100 pages of Out in the Cold when I was writing it. There was only all that remained pretty much in Out in the Cold was the beginning of the story on a boat. But the events on the boat weren't really happening. Actually, they did. A lot of the events already were happening, but the story ended up in Monaco. And I had a whole scene where there was stuff going on in Monaco and then other stuff going on, but it made no sense. And it's because um, for me, I had outlined a story that without talking about what the plot was, when began, it sounded good on paper. It looked good in the outline, but as I wrote it, it sounded much more like a Michael Crichton, Robin Cook kind of science medical thriller type story. it involves seed banks and biohacking and different things like that that had nothing to do with an Alex Martel story. It'd be a great story, but it wasn't the one I was trying to write. So I had to scrap it. And so, yeah, basically I got 5 or 10 chapters in, or, 80 to 100 pages in, and had to pull it all out, except for, again, some of the action sequences that didn't speak to the plot or the storyline. So yeah, I find that, I mean, that was a challenge for sure. But and it's because I tried to do something that it's not a natural way for me to write.
Yeah. Let's go back to just the inspiration. I mean, the character Alex, um, and in the green room, you and I had discussed this a little briefly. Obviously, it's a female protagonist. It's not often that you see female protagonists in these types of. I don't necessarily call it a military thriller. I mean, it's more like a kind of a spy action type thriller.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, speaking as somebody who has written, I have a female assassin series, so like I have written, these types of books from a female point of view. I really enjoy doing those. I haven't gotten back to it in a while just because I've been working on other projects. But again, you look at a lot of your peers who have had, recent books come out. Um, I honestly can't, off the top of my head, think of anybody else who has written any with a female protagonist. So it is something that is very rare. What was the inspiration, behind Alex?
It was never something I planned to write. I sat down to write a lot of stories featuring male protagonists. And every time again, because I sit down, I picture a character, I get writing, the voice, the dialogue comes out, the narrative comes out, the narration comes out, whatever. And I was writing as I was writing from the male perspective of the protagonists, the male protagonists I was creating. None of them sounded authentic to me. They all had that Humphrey Bogart, dark alley, smoking a cigarette in a trench coat and a fedora kind of sound to them, the voice. So I couldn't find that authentic voice. And then one day I was writing, it was actually in a screenplay, but I was writing a scene, it's the beginning of a story where there's some investigators gathered around a canal in Amsterdam where they're digging, fishing a body out of a canal in Amsterdam. And up rolls this Volvo, and out of the Volvo steps this woman, this investigator, an Interpol investigator. And lo and behold, as I wrote that character and introduced her to more scenes, her voice spoke more to me, and I was able to get more of an authentic feel for who that character was. And that wasn't Alex, that was a forerunner to Alex. Her name was Rachel Danaher, as it turns out. So, but and that story ended up going nowhere, but it was funny that I had this feeling that I could write from that perspective quite well. And then it was maybe a couple of years later that I started writing again. The scene didn't feature Alex yet. It was by a long shot, that story I mentioned earlier. It was a scene in the backstory takes place in Sarajevo during the siege of Sarajevo in the early 90s, 92, 93, in that era. And it's kids around a Christmas tree is kind of the story. And then something happens later. The opening scene, really, the action kicks off with a sniper scene where someone in Budapest in Hungary is taken out with a long range sniper shot. And then you cut to the Interpol office. Lo and behold, there's Alex. And Alex, actually, she's walking. We see her first walking through the cool as in cold, windy day into her office. And it's this character, Alex, who really had her roots in this other character, Rachel. But I kept writing from that perspective. And so Alex's character really, when I started writing her, took on a life of her own and allowed me an opportunity to explore that character. And that just became the main character of my story in the series. So it was more a case of Alex found me than I found or was even looking for her.
Yeah.
Love at first
It,
sight, I guess.
and knowing how publishing is, did you get any pushback when you guys were shopping that around about a male author writing a female protagonist?
So that's a good question because, and it's probably an answer I don't know, because when we went out with Perfect Shot, we went out to, I won't say exactly how many, but maybe half a dozen, 8 editors, maybe half a dozen, 6, 7, 8 editors, something like that. So again, for those who don't know the business, when you go out on submission, it means you're sending your manuscript around looking for a publisher. So your agent, it used to be they send it in the mail, but now it's emailed. You identify a group of editors at publishing houses that might want to buy it. Um, so the fact that six or seven of those editors rejected it, I don't have any knowledge of why it was rejected. I
Oh,
do know,
you didn't get like see the actual passes?
no, I literally never got a pass note, like a note from anybody, or did I maybe one? I don't know, but I didn't, for that one, we got the pickup, but I didn't see any of the rejections, interestingly enough. And I think they just got back to my agent and said, no, thanks, but there was no, to my knowledge, and John is great. He's a great agent. He'd have shared the reasons and the
Yeah.
um, why there was a pass. But no, there was no reasons given. So whether that factored in, I have no idea. But I do
Interesting.
know that St. Martin's, so Minotaur Books is my publisher, and St. Martin's Press is, Minotaur is a subsidiary or an imprint of St. Martin's. They were fully on board with it, and they still are. They love the series. They love the character. Um, the editor who picked it up, even though he left to go to a different publisher, he loved that the whole storyline, but the way the protagonist was voiced. So I
Yeah.
didn't get any pushback from them. I get more pushback, I think, from readers, but so far not so much from the publishing community.
When you say pushback from readers, is it is it female readers who are giving you pushback or male readers?
I think I can tell you 100% it's the male readers. Some of my worst reviews, my 1 star, 2 star reviews, have been from male readers who aren't keen on the female character in the
Yeah.
role that she's in. Either calling it,
Yeah.
a woke idea or different things, but just those who I think are less open to the idea of a woman being a capable, tough character. And I think, whether they get that idea from everyday life and the lives they lead, which would be sad because if you read my acknowledgments in Perfect Shot, the character of Alex didn't come out of nowhere. Even though she's a product of my imagination, she's very much inspired by actual women I've known, have worked with, and married to. There's a lot of badass, kick-ass, tough, strong, capable, competent women in the world. And I think one of the biggest compliments I get comes from female readers who, when they write in their reviews stuff like, I never thought in today's world, well, and they go a little further. I never thought in today's misogynistic world that I'd be able to read about a character like Alex, a kick-ass woman who does all these things. But then they go further. One in particular went further and said, I was relieved when I read the acknowledgments in the back of Perfect Shot that these types of people can and do exist. So those, I get pushback from I think the male audience. I get probably a little more support from the female audience, but at the same time, I think women might be. It's kind of a double-edged sword. It's an action. It's a spy thriller. It's a high-octane action thriller, semi-military, semi-law enforcement, not necessarily a genre that women gravitate towards.
Yeah.
So I think initially, if they see it on the shelf, they might not pick it up and buy it because it's not necessarily a story or a genre they're used to. But I know for a fact that, when people pick it up, even if they tell me later it's not their first type of read, I think they often are surprised at the fact they liked it because if I'm doing my job right as a writer, I'm not just writing action sequences. I'm writing a story, and ultimately a story is about and has to be about relationships and people and humans. It's humans that populate the story. It's not AI. It's not robots. So I hope in my storytelling, I'm telling a human story as much as I'm telling a spy story. And that's what I think ultimately people will come back to is the human side of Alex and the cast in the books.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean the real important thing is it an entertaining read.
Right.
And that I mean at least that's how I would view it, is this entertaining? Is it fun? You don't have to say it, but I'll say it, I mean it definitely, yeah, what it comes down to in this case is just, a lot of some male readers are just being sexist. They're just like, oh, female, I don't want to read it. I don't read anything about that. Which is a shame because again, they're probably missing out on a lot of other books, yours included, but there's other authors out there who do have, even female authors who have. I remember actually, her name escapes me, but she's written horror, she's written some spy stuff, and she wrote Red Widow. Her name,
Oh, Alma Katsu.
yes, I think remember seeing somewhere. I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I think this was back when I had been on Twitter, um, making some type of comment about like people say they want a female protagonist in spy thrillers, but then they don't buy that type of stuff or whatever. So like yeah, I mean it's not just it's like other authors kind of run into this, and it's just again I think it's definitely there's a misogynistic part of the readership, unfortunately, at least right now. Hopefully that changes. So, all right. So what kind of research in terms of, I mean, so you're a Canadian, you live in
Yeah.
Canada.
Yeah.
Um, Perfect Shot. I haven't read the most recent one, but I read Perfect Shot. I mean, that takes all, none of it takes place in Canada. It's all in Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, and like what type of research like were you doing for these? Like was it just like, on Google Earth or like were you actually visiting those places? I mean, how much does that research come into it?
Oh, totally, tons. I mean, I pride myself. I call it high fidelity writing. I like to. So if I go back to Tom Clancy, he wasn't just making shit up. He was basing stuff on known tech. I mean, maybe he was imagining technologies like the Caterpillar drive on a submarine, you know, but ultimately he was basing it on real weapons, you little ones, big ones, everything in between. But also when you read something about a place from Tom Clancy or Robert Ludlum, you were put in those places, or Dan Brown with the Da Vinci Code and those other books, his other books. You were put in those places geographically. You were situated right inside the church or the building or the square or the road. And I love that kind of writing. I'm the kind of guy who, if I see something in a book and I don't really know about it, I'll stop for a minute, go look it up, and then come back because now I've educated myself a little bit on, well, where is this place he's talking about? Um, and I always liked that as a reader. And as a writer, I want to write the books that I want to read, if you know what I mean. I'm writing because I'm writing a book that I literally would buy because that's how I write. That's what I want to do. I want to entertain the reader to the point that they obviously will want to go buy the book and the next one, but I want to write a book that people can feel the place, look up a place, whatever. And for Perfect Shot, it's funny because I wrote that in lockdown, and I was sitting on a military base in Ontario. So I was as a commander of the province's disaster response team. We were responsible for managing the first isolation, and we weren't calling it quarantine, obviously back then, but we were responsible. So the first group of Canadians that came back from China had to be isolated before they were kind of let back out in the general population. Same with the cruise ships. Everybody that came back off the cruise ships had to be isolated until it was demonstrated that they didn't have COVID. Well, it was my team that ran those along. It was a huge effort with multiple agencies, but ultimately the boots on the ground, we set the field hospital up, we set the quarantine facilities up, the isolation units up. That was the team I ran. And so I was on a military base in February or March of 2020, looking out the window over the St. Lawrence River and writing the first bit of the story. So it was very much, you couldn't go anywhere at the time. So I was relying on Google Earth, Google Maps. Whenever I thought of a place I wanted to set the story, I'd have to do quite a bit of research, whether it was Arnhem in the Netherlands, where part of the story takes place. So I was very dependent on the computer and Google for that. But then once we had a chance, and before it was published, I had a chance to go overseas and fly to Europe, travel to Europe with my wife. And we visited all the locations other than Moscow, which by then was shut down because of things that Russia was up to, their little special military operation in Ukraine. Um, so everywhere that was in perfect shot, except Turkey and Moscow, I went to. So London, Paris, Arnhem, The Hague, etc. I got a chance to visit all those places. and walk the actual streets and go into the bars. Every bar I mentioned, every coffee shop I mentioned is a real place. So I got a chance to actually go into all those places doing the physical research that followed the computer research. I think that's, if you can, I think that's an important step because for me, again, if you think of that high fidelity writing aspect, there's things you'll get from being in a place that you won't get by just reading about it or seeing it on a computer. Whether it's what the wind feels like or the direction of the wind or what the breeze smells like. You know, is it dusty? Is it smoky? Is there food smells constantly in the air? So for me, it's important to travel to the places once I've written about them or beforehand. Um, Book two, Out in the Cold, while doing the research for Perfect Shot, I had already visited the south of France, and it opens up on a mega yacht on the Mediterranean. So I had already been down to Antibes, France, and Nice, Monaco, that whole area, Villefranche, all that. And that found its way into book two. Book three, which we can talk about later, it takes place largely in Tanzania. And I did a safari in Tanzania back in 2019. So a lot of the notes and the photographs I have from that trip are finding their way into the story. So, you know, there's the computer research, but for me, it's really important also to be boots on the ground at some point along the way too.
So timeline wise, did you say so you had sold Perfect Shot and then you were in Europe? Or I guess my
Yes.
question is, were there certain things that you found on actually being in those places that you realized, oh, I want to add this into the manuscript that had not been there previously?
Yeah, and as importantly, there was a scene that I had written in Perfect Shot as part of a chase scene that once I was in that location, I realized they couldn't do what I said they could do. And 99.99% of readers wouldn't know it or care, but anybody who had driven that road, it was a back road. So in the beginning of the story, there's an airfield mentioned, Turlet Airfield, and there's Dealin Air Force Base. So there's a couple of locations at the beginning of the story. Well, as the bad guys are fleeing and Alex is chasing in a helicopter, the bad guys take a shortcut from this lane away up onto the highway. And it looked like they could do that on Google Maps. But when I walked it, you couldn't do it. So I changed the story because of that. And again, did it matter? Probably no one would care, but I did
Mhm.
it anyway, and I discovered it only by being there. So I had to rewrite that scene and a couple of others along the way too. You know, I'm driving the road and I was looking to see, you know, would Alex have the same sight lines that I say she'd have if she were driving this route? And the answer was no. So I changed how I wrote that scene or other scenes based on what I found. So yeah, I think being there really, I mean, it helps me to know that I'm putting the most authenticity into my story. Again, you know, most readers will never care, never see it, but to me, it's important. And I actually had someone fact check. He's a good friend of mine. He's a fellow writer, James Lawler, former CIA legend, James Lawler, and he has his own book series out, which, by the way, are great books. Twinkle of the Eye or Twinkle in the Eye is one. But anyway, James was reading Perfect Shot, and he said he got to a scene where I mentioned there's 7 steps leading into a Lloyd's Bank in London off Threadneedle Street. And he said he stopped reading, went to Google Street View, and counted the steps. And lucky for me, there were 7 steps there. So that was a combination of having checked it out on Google, but then having verified it in person too. So it's fun, things like that. I do enjoy that part of it. To me, it's fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say for anybody who wants to write these types of books, obviously that type of research is important. But the thing that you'll definitely get feedback on is if you screw something up regarding guns. Any type of caliber, the type of round, whatever else, any little thing, you're going to get emails about. So that's
Yeah, and I
definitely
had Yeah, and I used so there were people in our community that I bounced ideas off of to help build some of the not the backstory so much as some of the what was possible, what was not. Um, but when it came to the shoot, because Alex is a sniper, She kind of falls into the role accidentally, as it were. Um, but because she's essentially a world champion long range or sniper, a world record holder at some point in her life, I had to make sure that I made that believable. So any of the shots I set up for the story, including again the first one that was never published, they all went through someone who's become a friend of mine. He was a Canadian Forces sniper with I probably can't even mention the team, but with a special forces team, a very high-end special forces team. And he did multiple deployments in Afghanistan. Um, he's a renowned sniper. So basically, anything I wrote that involved a long-range shot, I ran it by my friend. So it's something you have to do because, like you said, you mess up on the ballistics, or you're one click too much on the scope or something, and someone's going to tell you.
Absolutely.
And they're very
So
knowledgeable people out there, so they kind of do hold your feet to the fire for authenticity.
that's right. So we're getting close to the top of the hour. I want to keep much more of your time, but what can you the brand new book that just came out? Well,
Out
what
in the
can you
cold?
tell us about? Just kind of give us like the elevator pitch about what this one's about.
Oh, okay. So Out in the Cold is Alex is basically someone's messing with one of the newest NATO allies, Finland. There's disruption operations are happening. Things are happening. Someone's messing with the power grid. Hospital power is going out. Um, there are environmental accidents happening left, right, and center in the Baltic Sea. Everyone is blaming Russia, thinking that they're having their way and having some fun with Finland just to poke the West in the eyes for letting Finland join NATO. Um, so as that's all happening, the West begins to mount their own response. So you're getting a bit of a buildup of forces in the Baltic Sea and the Baltic region. And as America and its allies ramp up military resources in the Baltic Sea, so too does Russia ramp up their own arsenal in Northwest Russia, in St. Petersburg, etc. So you get a bit of an arms race that's developing, and sooner or later it's going to lead to war. So Alex is tasked with finding out what's going on. And by chance and by luck, and because Alex is stubborn, she takes a different direction to get there and is put on to a different story, as it were, where she's now trying to figure out, is it actually Russia that's doing this, or who's responsible? And once she knows the answer, she has to convince the higher ups of what's going on and deal with it as Alex would deal with it. So there's a lot of fun, and it's a fun story. There's some good chase scenes. Lots of characters from book one make their way into, so from Perfect Shot make their way into Out in the Cold, and it's a good time. Again, I think the reader's going to enjoy reading.
Perfect. And I'll say the covers that they came up with, those are some great covers. How long? Obviously, the second cover is from the branding of the first cover. Like when they did the first cover, how many iterations until you guys came up with that look?
That was it. That was their first attempt.
Right out of the gate. That, oh my
Right out of the
God, that's
gate.
amazing.
Yeah. They actually asked me if I had any ideas, and all I said, I sent them like 5 pictures of covers I liked, including Greg Hurwitz's covers, 2 or 3 covers I hated. And I said, I like bold colors. I don't like this style or whatever. The very first cover they showed me was the one that's on Perfect Shot now. And it was the
Wow.
same for Out in the Cold. It was right out of the gate, exactly as you see it. It's a phenomenal team that over there at
Yeah, that does
CBRNE.
not happen often.
Yeah, I was
To
blown
get it
away.
right at the beginning and no tweaks. So
Well,
okay, so this will be
Ryan Steck, the real book spy, recently wrote about Out in the Cold that he thinks that is probably the best cover of the year. So I'm taking that to the bank.
yeah, no, yeah, like I said, they are fantastic covers.
Yeah.
So all right, so this is the second book in the series. You said before the third book. The third book, I'm assuming, is that going to be out next year around this
Yes.
time?
Next, probably around November again.
Is there anything you can tell us, a kind of little sneak peek for people?
Absolutely. So in book two, we meet very briefly Alex's dad. He's a former Army general, David Martel. And after the events of book two conclude, Out in the Cold conclude, Alex and her dad decide to go on a safari in Tanzania. So lo and behold, they're on safari when some stuff goes down in the bush, and Alex takes care of business in the bush, and they're back at camp, and the next day her dad has to leave, and he disappears. He's kidnapped. So the story is about who's taken the general and why, and what does Alex do to get justice, get her dad back, seek revenge, and all that. So it's set mostly in Tanzania, and it's another high octane adventure story for Alex.
Perfect. Do you have like kind of an idea of like, how many books you kind of feel like an over, like an overarching arc for her so far, or is it going to be kind of more of a reacher, you can just keep going forever type thing?
Yeah, I think I don't know about forever for sure, but I definitely have again because the publisher asks for ideas. There are easily 6 or 7 books I have in my head for stories, Alex Martel stories, and I'm hoping I get to tell at least that many. So it's 3 for now. We'll see if there's going to be more after that, but definitely easily a half dozen, and hopefully even more than that.
Excellent. All right, Steve. Where can people find you online if they want to follow you or stalk you online?
It's Talk Me Online. So it's steverzany.com. So, as it's the usual spelling. But steverzany.com. And then, of course, my Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, they're all Steverzany as well, at Steverzany, so that I can be found on all the main platforms and my website. And I love it when readers reach out to me via the contact form on my website to tell me if I got something wrong or tell me if I got something right. I'd love to hear about it.
All right, perfect. So, the first novel was Perfect Shot, the most recent novel that just came out, like what, like a week or two ago?
A couple of weeks ago, yeah.
A couple weeks ago was out of the cold, or wait, out of the cold.
Out out in the cold.
I can just see the cover right there, right behind you, and I can just
Yeah,
like wait. And then obviously the third book is going to be out next year, so you definitely want to read these two to prepare for the third book. So Steve, again, thank you so much for hanging out. I'm sure I'll see you at Thriller Fest or somewhere at some point, and yeah, we'll see everybody next time.
for
Bye.
sure. Sounds good, Robert. Thank